Guerrilla warfare. The power of armies is a visible thing, formal and circumscribed in time and space. But who the limits of that power shall trace, which a brave people in delight can bring or hide at will, for freedom combating, but just revenge inflamed? No foot may chase, no eye can follow, to a fatal place, that power, that spirit, whether on the wing, like the strong wind, or sleeping like the wind, within its awful caves. William Wordsworth, 1811. If nuclear power weapons pulled military strategy away from conventional warfare in one direction, guerrilla warfare moved it in another. With nuclear weapons, the issue was about threatening society with extreme force. Guerrilla warfare was about the response of an enraged society to illegitimate military force. Although it later acquired an association with radical political movements, its basic attraction was as a method that can help weaker sides survive. Although as a form of warfare it was not at all new, and had recently been adopted to the American War of Independence. Guerrilla warfare gained its name from the tactics of ambush and harassment used during the Little War, fought by Spaniards against French occupation forces at the start of the 19th century. Wordsworth's poem refers to this campaign. Guerrilla warfare was therefore defensive, fought on home territory with the advantages of popular support and local knowledge. It was geared to a strategy of exhaustion, gaining time in the hope that the enemy would tire or that something else would turn up. Such warfare was unlikely to be successful on its own. Irregular forces worked most effectively when providing a distraction to an army, also facing regular forces in a more conventional campaign. Napoleon suffered in Spain because he also faced the British army. Similarly, Russian peasants made life additionally miserable for French forces in 1812. Clausewitz, who experienced the French occupation of Prussia and was in a position to observe the Spanish insurrection and the French debacle in Russia, made guerrilla warfare the subject of his early lectures and writing. In On War, it was considered a form of defense. By the 1820s, when Clausewitz wrote most of On War, it had become an uncommon strategy. Popular energies appeared to have been played out, and conservative states were in command. Guerrilla warfare could cause an occupying force trouble, but it was the last and desperate resort of an otherwise defeated people. A general uprising against an occupier would need to be nebulous and elusive, because as soon as it became concrete, it would be crushed. Though a strategically defensive concept, the tactics of guerrilla warfare had to be offensive, aiming to catch the enemy unawares. Guerrilla warfare would most likely be effective when conducted from rough and inaccessible terrain in a country's interior. Clausewitz did not see irregular militias as being of much value in the absence of regular forces. Jomini had a similar response. He understood the challenges militias could pose for occupying forces, and how difficult they might make wars of expansion if popular opinion could readily be excited. But he recoiled from the prospect. Wars in which entire peoples had become animated by religious, national, or ideological differences he considered deplorable. Organized assassination, arousing violent passions that make them spiteful, cruel, and terrible. He acknowledged that his prejudices were with the good old times, when the French and English guards courteously invited each other to fire first, rather than the frightful epoch when priests, women, and children throughout Spain plotted the murder of isolated soldiers. During the 1830s, the possibility that guerrilla warfare might serve an insurrection was raised by Mazzini's failed Young Italy campaign, with the red-shirted Giuseppe Garibaldi emerging as a gifted guerrilla commander. Despite this example, the main models for revolutionary violence remained a sudden uprising of the masses that would catch authorities by surprise. The idea that they might be worn down gradually in a prolonged campaign did not catch on. Friedrich Engels, in an article drafted for Karl Marx, saw the emergence of the guerrillas in Spain as a reflection of the failure of the Spanish army. Engels presented them as more of a mob than an army, motivated by hatred, revenge, and love of plunder. He tended to think in terms of conventional military formations, even when contemplating revolution, and assumed that after a revolution, a socialist republic would need a proper army for its defense. The presumption that a revolution would need a disciplined fighting force of class-conscious proletarians continued to influence socialist thinking, so that guerrilla warfare was seen as the domain of anarchists and criminals, of drunken riffraff indulging their violent tendencies. Though somewhat sympathetic to this view in Russia, Lenin refused to dismiss guerrilla warfare entirely, but he believed it could only be a subordinate form of struggle, not the main method, and would benefit from proper party discipline to keep it under control. Once the mass movement had reached a certain stage of development, guerrilla warfare was not out of the question during the fairly large intervals that would occur between the big exchangements in the Revolutionary Civil War. When, after the 1917 uprising, the Bolsheviks found themselves caught up in a civil war, Military Commissar Leon Trotsky also saw guerrilla warfare as a useful but subordinate form of fighting. It was demanding, so it required proper organization and direction, and must be free from amateurish and adventurous influences. It would not overthrow an enemy, but could cause difficulties. Whereas the stronger force would seek annihilation of the enemy using large-scale, centrally directed mass armies, the weaker force, Trotsky argued, might seek to disorganize the stronger using light, mobile units operating independently of one another. This followed Delbruck's distinction between annihilation and exhaustion. Trotsky was clearly in favor of annihilation. The Soviet power has been all the time, and is still, the stronger side. Its task was to crush the enemy, so as to free its hands for socialist construction. It was the enemy, therefore, that was attempting guerrilla warfare. This reflected the shift, for the proletariat was now the ruling class, and the Tsarists were the rebels. Trotsky denied that his strategy was too ponderous and positional, and lacked mobility. The Red Army had begun with volunteers, rebels, primitive, inexperienced guerrillas, and turned them into proper, trained, disciplined regiments and divisions. Nonetheless, as the Civil War became more challenging, Trotsky sought to form mobile guerrilla detachments, supplements to the weighty masses of the Red Army that would cause problems for the enemy on its rear. Guerrilla warfare was therefore viewed, even by radicals, as a lesser strategy, a defensive expedient, but not a source of victory. Lawrence of Arabia. The expansion of the European empires during the 19th century prompted regular uprisings and rebellions, which put their own demands on regular forces. The British Army put these tasks under the heading of imperial policing. The classic discussion was C.E. Caldwell's Small Wars, published in 1896, which observed that, as a general rule, the quelling of the rebellion in distant colonies means protracted, thankless, invertebrate war. It was Thomas Edward Lawrence, an archaeologist who made his name during the Great War, seeking to foment an Arab rebellion against Ottoman rule, who did the most to develop principles about how guerrilla warfare should be fought, rather than how it could be contained. Lawrence had not only a startling story to tell, but also impressive literary gifts. His vivid metaphors and aphorisms help explain his influence. His memoir of the campaign, The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, remains a classic. His basic philosophy of guerrilla warfare, with a brief history of the revolt, was first published in October 1920. After the war, he struggled with the myth he had helped to create about himself, as well as with the failure of the Allied government to honor the promises of independence Lawrence had made to the Arabs. The campaign against the Turks had begun in 1916, with operations against the long railroad between Medina and Damascus, a key supply line. The regular loss of trains frustrated the Turks, for whom fully protecting the railroad appeared impossible against the Arab enemy. Eventually, this turned into a full-scale Arab revolt, a major distraction for the Turks.